The scream that tore through our Iowa farmhouse at 3:47 a.m. on September 23, 1965, was my mother's final breath leaving her body. I know the exact time because I was staring at the alarm clock beside my bed, watching the red numbers blur through my tears as pneumonia finally claimed the only person who had ever truly loved me. I pressed my 12-year-old face against the cold bedroom door, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The scream made me shake all over, not just from the sound itself, but from what it meant. My mother was dying, and I was about to be completely alone in a world that had already shown me how cruel it could be to a girl with no protection. Dr. Morrison's heavy footsteps echoed through our house as he moved between the kitchen and Mama's bedroom. I could hear him speaking in low, serious tones to someone, probably Mrs. Henderson from next door, who had been helping care for Mama these past terrible weeks. The smell of medicine and sickness hung in the air like a fog I couldn't escape. When the house finally went quiet, I knew it was over. The silence felt different than sleep, heavier, more permanent. It pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't lift, making it hard to breathe. This wasn't the peaceful quiet of nighttime. This was the awful quiet that comes after someone dies, when their absence fills up all the space they used to occupy. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I'm telling you this story 53 years later from my small apartment in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm 65 now, with gray hair and hands that shake slightly when I write for too long. But that 12-year-old girl is still inside me, and her story, our story, needs to be told. Not because it's pretty or inspiring, but because it's true. And sometimes the truth is the only thing that can set you free. What happened after Mama died changed everything about who I was and who I would become. It's a story about how much damage one evil man can do, how fear can trap you in situations that seem impossible to escape, and how sometimes the only way out is through the very thing that terrifies you most. But it's also a story about finding strength you didn't know you had, about unlikely friendships that save your life, and about how love, real love, can survive even the worst circumstances. I need to warn you, this story contains details about sexual abuse, physical violence, and the kind of psychological cruelty that one human being can inflict on another. If you're not prepared for that, I understand. But if you stay with me, I promise to tell you, not just about the darkness, but about how I found my way back to the light. Our farmhouse sat on 40 acres of Iowa corn country, surrounded by fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. It was a simple 2-story building with white clapboard siding that needed paint and a wraparound porch where Mama and I used to shell peas on summer evenings. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Henderson, whose house was barely visible through the grove of oak trees that marked our property line. Mama had bought this place after my father died in a factory accident when I was 7. She worked as a registered nurse at Mercy General Hospital in town, pulling double shifts to make the mortgage payments. I spent most afternoons alone doing homework at the kitchen table and feeding our 6 chickens before starting dinner. It was a quiet life, but we were happy. Mama would come home exhausted, her white uniform wrinkled and her feet aching, but she always had time to help with my arithmetic or listen to me read aloud from whatever library book I'd chosen that week. "Education is the one thing no one can take away from you, Evie," she'd say, smoothing my dark hair while I worked. "Promise me you'll never stop learning, no matter what happens." I didn't understand then why she emphasized those last 4 words, "no matter what happens," with such intensity. Her brown eyes would get a distant look, like she was seeing something I couldn't see. Now I wonder if she somehow knew that our peaceful existence was too fragile to last. Mama started getting sick in early August. At first it was just a cough that wouldn't go away, the kind that made her chest rattle when she breathed. She tried to hide it from me, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth whenever the coughing fits got bad. But by the end of the month, she was too weak to work her shifts at the hospital. Dr. Morrison came to the house 3 times that final week each visit, leaving Mama weaker and more frightened than before. It's pneumonia," I heard him tell Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen while I was supposed to be sleeping. "Her immune system is compromised from exhaustion. She's been working herself to death trying to keep this place running." The night she died, Mama called me to her bedside. Her face was pale and thin, her breathing shallow and labored. She gripped my hand with surprising strength and looked directly into my eyes. Evelyn listened to me carefully. "In my dresser drawer underneath the drawer liner, there's an envelope with your name on it. If anything bad happens, anything that makes you feel unsafe or scared, you open that envelope. Do you understand?" I nodded, even though I didn't really understand at all. Bad things. What could be worse than losing her? And remember what I've always told you about your strength. You come from a long line of strong women, and that strength is in your blood. Never forget that no matter how dark things get. She died 3 hours later, while I was sleeping fitfully in the chair beside her bed. When I woke up, her hand in mine had gone cold. The funeral was held on a gray September morning, with a light rain that seemed appropriate for saying goodbye to the most important person in my world. I stood beside her grave in my only black dress, a hand-me-down from Mrs. Henderson's daughter, watching as they lowered the wooden casket into the ground. Most of the people there were from the hospital where Mama worked nurses and doctors who spoke quietly about what a dedicated woman she had been. That's when I first met Frank Murdoch. He appeared beside me as the service was ending, a tall man with broad shoulders and rough hands stained yellow from cigarettes. His hair was dark with streaks of gray, and his eyes were a cold blue that reminded me of winter ice. He wore a cheap black suit that didn't fit quite right, and he smelled like motor oil and whiskey. "You must be Evelyn," he said, his voice rough and gravelly. "I'm Frank Murdoch. I work with your mother at the hospital maintenance department. She talked about you all the time." I had never heard Mama mention anyone named Frank, but I was too numb with grief to question it. Behind him stood a teenage boy with the same cold blue eyes, though his face was softer, less defined. He looked about 16 with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that hung loose on his thin frame. "This is my son, Jack," Frank continued. "We're real sorry for your loss, little girl. Real sorry." Jack nodded at me, but didn't speak. There was something in his expression that I couldn't identify, not quite sympathy, but not indifference either. Later, I would recognize it as fear. "Now I know you're probably wondering what's going to happen to you." Frank went on his hand, settling heavily on my shoulder. "A girl your age can't live alone in that big farmhouse. Lucky for you, I've been talking to the county social services, and they agree that the best thing would be for you to come stay with Jack and me, at least until we can figure out a more permanent arrangement." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, frowning. "Now wait just a minute, Frank. I don't recall anyone discussing this with me. I was planning to take Evelyn in myself just temporarily until—" "That's kind of you, Gladys, but it's all been decided," Frank interrupted smoothly. "The paperwork's already filed. Besides, a young girl needs a father figure, don't you think, someone to provide proper guidance and discipline?" The word discipline made something cold settle in my stomach, but I was too overwhelmed to protest. Mrs. Henderson looked like she wanted to argue further, but Frank's presence seemed to intimidate her. He had that effect on people, a way of taking up space that made others step back and stay quiet. "Don't you worry about a thing, Evelyn," Frank said, his grip tightening on my shoulder. "Jack and I are going to take real good care of you. You'll see." The first 2 weeks living in Frank's house passed in a blur of grief and adjustment. His place was smaller than our farmhouse, a cramped 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of town, with thin walls and a perpetual smell of cigarette smoke and fried food. Frank worked the night shift at a factory that made car parts, which meant he slept during the day and was awake all evening and night. Jack attended the local high school, but never seemed to have any friends or activities that kept him out of the house. I was given a narrow cot in what had been a storage room, barely big enough for the bed and a small dresser. The walls were thin enough that I could hear everything that happened in the rest of the house. Frank's television programs, his phone conversations, and worst of all, the sounds that came from Jack's room when Frank decided his son needed correction for some imagined failure. Those correction sessions usually happened late at night after Frank had been drinking. I would lie on my cot listening to the sound of Frank's belt against flesh, followed by Jack's muffled cries, and Frank's harsh voice explaining what Jack had done wrong and why he deserved punishment. Sometimes it was for getting a C on a test, sometimes for forgetting to take out the garbage, sometimes for reasons I couldn't understand at all. "A man doesn't make excuses," Frank would growl. "A man takes responsibility and accepts the consequences of his actions. How are you ever going to be a man if you keep sniveling like a little girl?" During the day, Jack would move carefully, favoring whatever part of his body had received Frank's attention the night before. He never complained or mentioned what had happened, but I could see the results in the way he winced when he sat down, or the careful way he put on his shirt to avoid aggravating welts on his back. Frank was always polite to me during those first weeks, asking about school, making sure I had enough to eat, even helping me with my math homework when I struggled with fractions. But there was something in the way he looked at me that made me uncomfortable, an intensity in his gaze that felt different from normal adult concern. Sometimes I would catch him staring at me while I was doing dishes or reading, and when our eyes met, he would smile in a way that didn't reach his eyes. The change came on a Thursday evening in early October. I was in the kitchen washing the dinner dishes when I heard Frank talking to Jack in the living room. At first, their voices were too low for me to make out the words, but gradually Frank's voice rose, taking on the same harsh tone he used during the late-night correction sessions. "You're 16 years old, Jack. 16. When I was your age, I already knew what it meant to be a man. But you look at you. Skinny as a rail, scared of your own shadow, can't even look a girl in the eye without blushing like some kind of sissy." "I'm not scared, Pa." Jack's voice was quiet but steady. "I just don't know how to act around females. Just don't understand what your responsibilities are as a man." Frank's voice grew louder, more aggressive. "Well, it's time you learned. Past time." I stopped washing dishes and moved closer to the kitchen doorway, trying to hear better. Something in Frank's tone sent a chill down my spine, a cold certainty that whatever he was building up to it would be bad for both Jack and me. "You see that girl in there?" Frank continued, and I realized with growing horror that he was talking about me. 12 years old and already starting to develop. Pretty little thing, isn't she? Reminds me of her mother at that age. The plate I was holding slipped from my soapy hands and crashed to the floor, but I barely noticed. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Pa, what are you saying?" Jack's voice cracked slightly. "I'm saying it's time you learned what women are for boy. Time you learned how to control them, how to make them submit, how to show them who's in charge. And that little girl in there is going to be your teacher." "No." The word came out of Jack like a gasp. "No, Pa, I can't, I won't." The sound of Frank's hand hitting Jack's face echoed through the house like a gunshot. I jumped back from the doorway, my whole body trembling. "And you'll do what I tell you to do." Frank's voice was deadly quiet now, more frightening than when he'd been shouting. "You'll do it tonight, and you'll do it right, or I'll do it myself. And trust me, boy, I won't be as gentle as you will be." I heard Jack's footsteps moving toward the kitchen, and I frantically began picking up the pieces of the broken plate, cutting my finger on a sharp edge. When Jack appeared in the doorway, his face was white, and there was a red handprint on his left cheek. "Evelyn," he said, his voice hoarse, you should go to your room now." I looked up at him, seeing the fear and anguish in his eyes, and suddenly understood exactly what Frank was asking him to do. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow, making it hard to breathe. "Jack, please," I whispered. "Please don't." His face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked younger than his 16 years. "I'm sorry." he said so quietly I could barely hear him. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn. But if I don't do what he says," he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I could see the terror in his eyes, the absolute certainty that defying Frank would result in something even worse for both of us. That night, I lay on my narrow cot, listening to Frank's footsteps in the hallway outside my door, waiting for the sound of the doorknob turning. When it finally came, I closed my eyes and tried to pretend I was somewhere else, back in our farmhouse with Mama safe and loved and protected. But there was no protection here and no safety. There was only Frank's twisted idea of what it meant to be a man, and Jack's desperate need to avoid his father's wrath in me, a 12-year-old girl with nowhere to run and no one to help her. The morning after that first night, I stood in front of the cracked mirror in the tiny bathroom, staring at a reflection I barely recognized. There were bruises on my throat in the shape of fingers, and my lips were swollen from being forced to stay quiet. I pulled my long-sleeved shirt up to my neck and used some of the makeup I'd found in the medicine cabinet to cover the worst of the marks. At breakfast, Frank sat at the head of the small table drinking coffee and reading the newspaper as if nothing had happened. He looked up when I entered the kitchen, his cold blue eyes examining my face with clinical interest. "Morning, Evelyn. You sleep well?" The question was casual, almost friendly, but there was something underneath it, a satisfaction that made me feel sick to my stomach. I nodded without speaking and poured myself a glass of orange juice with shaking hands. Jack came downstairs a few minutes later, his hair uncombed and his face pale. He wouldn't look at me directly, but I could see the shame and guilt written in every line of his body. When he reached for the cereal box, I noticed his hands were shaking too. "Jack," Frank said without looking up from his newspaper. "You did good last night, son. Real good. Shows me you might have some potential after all." Jack's face flushed red, and he mumbled something that might have been, "Thank you," or might have been, "Please stop." "Course, there's still a lot you need to learn," Frank continued conversationally. "Practice makes perfect, as they say. Good thing you've got plenty of time to practice." The implication was clear, and it hit me like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't going to be a one-time thing. Frank expected this to continue night after night until Jack had learned whatever twisted lesson Frank thought he needed to teach. School became my only escape from the nightmare my life had become. For 7 hours each day, I could pretend to be a normal 12-year-old girl worrying about pop quizzes and whether the other kids liked my clothes. I threw myself into my studies with desperate intensity, earning perfect grades on every assignment and test. Learning became a way to prove to myself that my mind was still my own, even if my body was not. But even at school, I lived in constant fear that someone would notice the changes in me. I started wearing long sleeves and high necklines to hide the bruises that appeared with increasing frequency. I stopped participating in gym class, claiming I had asthma because I couldn't risk anyone seeing the marks on my arms and legs in the locker room. My teacher, Mrs. Patterson, noticed that I'd become withdrawn and quiet. "Evelyn, is everything all right at home?" she asked one afternoon, after keeping me behind when the other students left. "I know this must be a difficult adjustment, losing your mother and living in a new situation." For a moment, I almost told her everything. The words crowded in my throat, fighting to escape. "It's not all right. Frank makes Jack hurt me at night. I'm scared all the time. I don't know how to make it stop." But then I remembered Frank's warning from the night before. "You tell anyone about our family business, girl, and you'll find out what real pain feels like. Besides, who's going to believe a little girl with a reputation for making up stories?" I hadn't been aware that I had a reputation for making up stories, but Frank's certainty that no one would believe me felt like truth. Who would believe such a horrible accusation against a man who had generously taken in an orphaned girl? Who would take the word of a grieving 12-year-old over that of a respectable adult? "I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson," I said, forcing myself to smile. "Just still adjusting, like you said." She didn't look convinced, but she let me leave without pressing further. At home, the situation continued to deteriorate. Frank's demands became more frequent and more specific. He would give Jack detailed instructions about what he was supposed to do, how he was supposed to do it, and how long it should take. Afterward, Frank would quiz Jack about the experience, asking questions that made both of us sick with shame and humiliation. "The key is control," Frank would explain in his matter-of-fact voice. "Women are naturally rebellious and disobedient. It's in their nature. But if you establish dominance early and maintain it consistently, they'll learn to submit. It's for their own good, really. They're happier when they know their place." Jack never argued with these explanations, but I could see the conflict tearing him apart. Sometimes when Frank wasn't looking, he would mouth, "I'm sorry," to me across the room. Other times, he wouldn't look at me at all, as if he could make what was happening disappear by refusing to acknowledge it. I started having nightmares every night, not just about what was happening to me, but about what would happen if I tried to fight back or run away. In my dreams, Frank would catch me trying to escape and would punish both Jack and me in ways that were even worse than what was already happening. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, feeling trapped in a situation that had no solution. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, though that was bad enough. The worst part was the way Frank was slowly erasing the person I had been before my mother died. The confident, curious girl who had dreamed of traveling the world and becoming a teacher was disappearing, replaced by someone who was afraid of her own shadow and too terrified to speak up for herself. But somewhere deep inside, in a place Frank couldn't reach, that original Evelyn was still alive. She was angry, and she was planning, and she was waiting for her chance to fight back. By my 13th birthday in February, I had learned to navigate the dangerous waters of Frank's household with the skill of someone much older. I could read his moods by the way he held his cigarette or the tone he used when talking to Jack. I knew which of his behaviors meant I would have a relatively peaceful night, and which ones meant I should prepare for something worse than usual. The physical evidence of what was happening to me had become harder to hide. I was getting taller and developing in ways that Frank commented on with disturbing frequency. I started binding my chest with strips of cloth torn from old bedsheets, trying to make myself look as young and undeveloped as possible. I wore loose clothing and kept my hair pulled back in a severe ponytail that made me look plain and unremarkable. But Frank's attention wasn't diminishing. If anything, it was intensifying. He had started taking photographs during the worst incidents, claiming he needed to document Jack's progress in learning to be a man. The camera added a new dimension of humiliation to the abuse, making me feel like what was happening to me was being preserved forever. "These pictures are just for educational purposes," Frank would explain while adjusting the lighting. "Jack needs to be able to study his technique, see where he can improve. It's all part of the learning process." I begged Jack to refuse to participate in the photography sessions, but he was as trapped as I was. Frank had made it clear that any resistance would result in punishment for both of us, and that punishment would be far worse than what we were already enduring. He showed me pictures of what he did to my mother. Jack whispered to me one afternoon when Frank was at work. Before she left, he said, "If I don't do exactly what he tells me, he'll do the same things to you, and then he'll do worse things to me. I can't. Evelyn, I can't let that happen." It was the first time Jack had spoken directly to me about what was happening, and seeing the desperation in his eyes made me realize that he was as much a victim in this situation as I was. Frank had spent years breaking down his son's will and sense of right and wrong, turning him into an unwilling accomplice in his own twisted games. That spring, I started looking for ways to escape. I had been saving the small amounts of money I occasionally found around the house quarters that fell out of Frank's pockets, dollar bills left on counters. It wasn't much, but I thought it might be enough for a bus ticket to somewhere far away. The problem was that I had nowhere to go. Mrs. Henderson had moved to Florida to live with her sister, taking away the one adult who might have helped me. I had no other relatives that I knew of, and the social services system that had placed me with Frank was the same system I would have to convince that he was abusing me. I started spending time at the public library after school researching resources for children in abusive situations. What I found was discouraging. Most of the advice assumed that the child had a trusted adult they could talk to, or that the abuse was being committed by someone outside the family who could be reported to the authorities. My situation, being abused by my legal guardian with no other family to turn to, seemed to fall through the cracks of every system designed to help. But the library also gave me access to something else: stories of other people who had survived terrible situations and found ways to escape or overcome them. I read biographies of Holocaust survivors, escaped slaves, prisoners of war, anyone who had endured the unendurable and lived to tell about it. Their stories gave me hope that survival was possible even when everything seemed hopeless. One book in particular caught my attention: a memoir by a woman who had been held captive by a family member for several years before finally escaping. She wrote about the importance of maintaining hope, of holding on to the person you were before the abuse began, and of looking for opportunities to break free even when they seemed impossible to find. The key to survival, she wrote, is remembering that even in the darkest situations, you still have choices. They may be terrible choices, limited choices, choices between bad and worse, but they are still choices, and as long as you can choose, you are not completely powerless. Reading those words gave me something I hadn't felt in months: a sense of agency. I might not be able to stop what was happening to me right now, but I could start preparing for the day when I would be old enough and strong enough to fight back. I started keeping a detailed journal of everything that was happening, writing in a small notebook I kept hidden behind a loose board in my bedroom wall. I documented every incident of abuse, every threat Frank made, every time Jack was forced to participate against his will. I wrote down dates, times, specific details that would be hard to dismiss as the fantasies of a disturbed child. I also started paying closer attention to Frank's routines and habits, looking for patterns that might give me an advantage. I learned that he was usually passed out drunk by 2 a.m., that he kept his wallet in the same place every night, that he never locked the front door because he was too paranoid about fire to risk being trapped inside. Most importantly, I started talking to Jack, really talking to him, not just the desperate whispers we exchanged when Frank was out of earshot. I began to understand that he hated what he was being forced to do as much as I hated having it done to me. He was not my enemy. He was another prisoner in Frank's house of horrors. We could run away together, I suggested one evening when Frank was working late. You're almost 18. In some states, you'd be considered an adult. We could go somewhere he'd never find us. Jack looked at me with a mixture of hope and despair. He'd find us, Evelyn. He always finds people who try to leave him. And when he brought us back, he shuddered. I've seen what he does to people who try to leave. But I could see that the idea had taken root in his mind, and over the following weeks, we began to plan in earnest. It wasn't much of a plan, more of a desperate hope than a realistic strategy, but it gave us something to focus on besides our daily survival. We would wait until Jack turned 18 in August. Then we would take whatever money we could find, steal Frank's car, and drive as far away as we could get, before he realized we were gone. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was a plan, and having it made the unbearable days slightly more bearable. What we didn't know was that Frank had been watching us more carefully than we realized, and that our whispered conversations had not gone unnoticed. The discovery came on a sweltering July evening when the air conditioning had broken, and the house felt like an oven. I was in my room writing in my hidden journal by the light of a small flashlight when I heard Frank's footsteps in the hallway. They were different from his usual heavy tread, more deliberate, more purposeful, like he was hunting for something specific. I quickly hid the journal behind the loose board and pretended to be asleep, but instead of passing by my door, Frank stopped. I heard him testing the doorknob slowly, then the soft sound of the door opening. Through half-closed eyes, I watched as he entered my room and began searching methodically through my belongings. My heart pounded as I forced myself to breathe slowly and evenly, trying to maintain the appearance of sleep. Frank went through my dresser drawers, looked under my mattress, and examined every inch of the small space. I thought he would miss the loose board. It was well hidden, and I had been careful to replace it exactly as I found it each time. But Frank was more thorough than I had given him credit for. He noticed the slight gap where the board didn't quite meet the others, and within moments he had pulled it free, and discovered not just my journal, but also the small amount of money I had managed to save, and a map of bus routes I had torn from a phone book. I couldn't pretend to be asleep anymore when he turned on the overhead light and stood at the foot of my bed holding the evidence of my planning. "Well, well," he said softly, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that was more frightening than shouting would have been. "What do we have here?" He opened the journal and began reading aloud from my entries, his voice growing more amused with each terrible detail I had recorded. Hearing my own words spoken in his voice made me feel sick and exposed in a way that was worse than anything physical he had done to me. July 10th. Frank made Jack use the camera again today. I tried to turn my face away, but Frank grabbed my chin and forced me to look directly at the lens. He said he wanted to see the fear in my eyes. Frank looked up from the journal with a smile that chilled me to the bone. "Very detailed, Evelyn. Very specific. You have quite a memory for a little girl." He continued reading, and with each entry, I felt my hope for escape slipping away. Everything I had written could be used against me, evidence of my planning, but also evidence of my participation twisted to make it look like I had been a willing partner in my own abuse. "Jack and I talked about running away again today," Frank read. "He said he knows how to hotwire a car, and I told him about the money I've been saving. We're going to wait until he turns 18, then drive to California and get jobs at a beach resort." Frank closed the journal and looked at me with mock disappointment. "Planning to steal my car were you, and involving my son in your little criminal enterprise?" I found my voice for the first time since he had entered the room. "It's not criminal to escape from someone who's hurting you." Frank's expression hardened. "Hurting you? Is that what you think is happening here, Evelyn? I've given you a home when you had nowhere else to go. I've fed you, clothed you, provided for your education. And this is how you repay me, by making up vicious lies and planning to run away like some kind of common criminal?" The way he said it with such conviction and apparent sincerity made me doubt my own memories for a moment. Could I have misunderstood what was happening? Were the things I remembered really as bad as they seemed? Or had my grief and trauma distorted my perception of reality? But then Frank opened the journal to a page near the back and began reading again, and I remembered why I had written everything down in the first place. June 15th. Frank brought home a new camera today. It's smaller than the old one, and he says it takes better pictures in low light. He spent an hour showing Jack how to use it, explaining different angles and positions that would capture the action more effectively. I wanted to throw up listening to him talk about it like it was some kind of art project. As he read my own words back to me, the reality of my situation crashed over me like a wave. This was not a misunderstanding or a distortion of memory. This was real, it was documented, and it was getting worse. "The thing is, Evelyn," Frank said, closing the journal and sitting down on the edge of my bed, "these little stories of yours could cause a lot of trouble for a lot of people if they fell into the wrong hands. People might get the wrong idea about what goes on in this house. They might think that Jack and I are some kind of monsters instead of understanding that we're just trying to teach you some important life lessons." He leaned closer, and I could smell the whiskey on his breath and the cigarette smoke that clung to his clothes. "But here's the thing that really interests me," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Reading through this journal, I can see that you've been paying very close attention to everything that happens. Very close attention indeed. So close that I'm starting to wonder if maybe you enjoy it more than you let on." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "That's not true," I whispered, but Frank held up a hand to silence me. "Oh, but it might be true, mightn't it? A girl your age writing down every detail, keeping careful records? That doesn't sound like the behavior of someone who's truly upset about what's happening. That sounds like someone who's fascinated by it. Someone who might even be encouraging it. I realized with growing horror that Frank was building a narrative that would make me complicit in my own abuse. By documenting what was happening to me, I had inadvertently provided him with evidence that could be twisted to support his version of events. And then, there's the matter of your escape plan. Frank continued conversationally. Involving my son in car theft, planning to cross state lines with a minor. Those are serious crimes, Evelyn. The kind of crimes that could get Jack sent to juvenile detention or worse. The full scope of the trap I was in became clear to me in that moment. Not only was I powerless to escape, but any attempt to seek help would potentially destroy Jack as well. Frank had maneuvered both of us into a position where resistance seemed impossible. But I'm not an unreasonable man, Frank said, standing up and straightening his shirt. I understand that teenagers get rebellious ideas sometimes. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to forget all about running away, and you're going to stop writing in journals, and you're going to accept that this is your life now. In return, I won't show these little stories to the police, and I won't have Jack charged as an accessory to your various criminal plans. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at me. Oh, and Evelyn. Since you seem to enjoy documenting our activities so much, I think it's time we gave you some new material to write about. Some more advanced lessons, you might say. Jack's 18th birthday is coming up soon, and I think it's time his education moved to the next level. After he left, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, feeling more trapped and hopeless than I had ever felt in my life. Every avenue of escape had been blocked, every plan had been discovered, and every attempt to fight back had only made my situation worse. But as the hours passed and the initial shock wore off, I began to think about what Frank had said and what he hadn't said. He had threatened to show my journal to the police and have Jack charged with various crimes, but he hadn't actually done those things yet, which meant he needed me to cooperate voluntarily, at least for now. And if Frank needed my cooperation, that meant I still had some power in this situation, even if it was limited and dangerous to use. For the first time in months, I began to plan not just my escape, but my revenge. Frank's threat to escalate Jack's education became reality on Jack's 18th birthday in August. What had been horrible before became unspeakable, and what had been unspeakable became a daily routine that left both Jack and me broken in ways that went far deeper than physical injury. The worst part was that Frank no longer bothered to pretend there was any educational purpose to what he was forcing Jack to do. It had become purely about power and control, about demonstrating to both of us that he owned our bodies and our futures completely. Now that you're 18, son, Frank announced over birthday cake that tasted like sawdust in my mouth, it's time you learned about real responsibility. Real adult responsibility. Jack had been quiet and withdrawn all day, and I could see the dread in his eyes as he listened to his father's words. He knew, as I did, that Frank's definition of adult responsibility would involve new and more terrible demands. That night, Frank introduced equipment and techniques that I won't describe in detail, but that left both Jack and me traumatized in ways that made our previous experiences seem almost benign in comparison. The physical pain was excruciating, but the psychological damage was worse. Frank was systematically destroying every aspect of our humanity, turning us into objects that existed solely for his entertainment and gratification. The photographs became more frequent and more explicit. Frank had upgraded to a professional quality camera and lighting system, and he spent hours arranging scenes that he would direct like some kind of perverted movie producer. He talked about selling the pictures to collectors who appreciated authentic amateur content, though I was never sure if this was a real plan or just another form of psychological torture. Jack stopped talking to me almost entirely. The guilt and shame of what he was being forced to do had broken something inside him, and he retreated into a shell of silence and compliance that frightened me more than his earlier resistance had. When I tried to reach out to him, To remind him that neither of us was responsible for what Frank was doing to us, he would just stare at me with empty eyes and shake his head. "I can't," he would whisper when I tried to discuss escape plans. "I can't fight him anymore, Evelyn. I can't even think about fighting him. It just makes everything worse." I realized that Frank had succeeded in breaking Jack's spirit completely. My partner in planning rebellion had become another tool of my oppression, and I was more alone than ever. School started again in September, but I was no longer able to maintain the pretense of being a normal teenager. My grades, which had always been perfect, began to slip as I found it impossible to concentrate on anything except surviving from one day to the next. Teachers who had once praised my academic performance began sending concerned notes home, which Frank would read with apparent puzzlement and concern. "I just don't understand what's gotten into Evelyn lately," he would tell them during parent-teacher conferences that I was forced to attend. "She's been so moody and withdrawn since her mother died. I've tried everything I can think of to help her adjust, but she seems determined to be difficult." The teachers would nod sympathetically and offer suggestions about grief counseling and family therapy, never suspecting that the concerned guardian sitting across from them was the source of all my problems. Frank played the role of the caring stepfather, perfectly expressing just the right amount of worry and frustration to deflect any suspicion. But there was one teacher who wasn't entirely convinced by Frank's performance. Mrs. Rodriguez, my English teacher, had been watching me closely since the school year began. She noticed the way I flinched when anyone touched me unexpectedly, the way I chose desks in the back corner of the classroom where I could keep an eye on both exits, the way I started awake if there was any sudden noise. One afternoon in late September, she asked me to stay after class to discuss an essay I had written about survival in extreme circumstances. The essay had been supposed to be about a character in a novel we were reading, but I had written instead about real-life survival situations, drawing on the research I had done at the library. "This is very powerful writing, Evelyn," Mrs. Rodriguez said, reading over my essay again. "But it's also very dark. You write about survival techniques with the kind of detail that suggests personal experience rather than academic research." I sat across from her desk, trying to look normal and unconcerned while my heart raced. "I just read a lot of books about survival stories. I find them interesting." "Yes, I can see that you've done extensive research." She looked up from the essay and studied my face carefully. "But some of these psychological survival techniques you describe, those aren't the kind of things you typically find in books written for general audiences. They're the kind of strategies that people develop when they're living in genuinely dangerous situations." I didn't respond, but I could feel her watching me, taking in details that other adults had missed or chosen to ignore. "Whoa, Evelyn, I want you to know that if you ever need someone to talk to about anything at all, my door is always open. Sometimes it helps to have an adult you can trust, someone who's not directly involved in your home situation." For a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything. Mrs. Rodriguez seemed different from the other adults who had failed to see what was happening to me. She was younger, less trusting of authority figures, more willing to consider that things might not be what they appeared to be. But then, I remembered Frank's threats about the journal, his promise to destroy Jack's life if I tried to seek help, and the very real possibility that even if Mrs. Rodriguez believed me, she might not be able to do anything to protect us. "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez," I said carefully. "I'll remember that." She looked disappointed, but not surprised by my response. "The offer stands, Evelyn. Anytime you need it." That evening, Frank was waiting for me when I got home from school, sitting in his chair with a beer in one hand and my essay in the other. "Interesting reading," he said without looking up. "Your teacher seems to think you have some kind of special insight into survival situations. Wonder where you might have gotten that." My blood turned to ice. She just liked the essay. It wasn't about anything specific, wasn't it? Frank folded the paper carefully and set it aside. "Because reading between the lines, it sounds to me like someone who's been giving a lot of thought to escape and resistance techniques. Someone who might be planning to cause trouble." He stood up and walked over to where I was standing by the front door, my backpack still clutched in my hands like a shield. I think it's time we had a conversation about the future, Evelyn. About what's going to happen now that you're getting older and starting to attract the wrong kind of attention from busybody teachers. What Frank told me in that conversation made it clear that my situation was about to get much worse. He had grown tired of the elaborate charade of being my caring guardian, and he was making plans to move us all to a more isolated location where he wouldn't have to worry about nosy neighbors or teachers asking uncomfortable questions. "There's a property up north," he explained casually, as if we were discussing vacation plans. "Way back in the woods, no close neighbors, no reason for anyone to come around asking questions. I think it would be good for all of us to have more privacy." The thought of being completely cut off from any potential help trapped in the wilderness with Frank and a broken Jack who could no longer be counted on as an ally filled me with despair so profound it was hard to breathe. But it also filled me with a desperate determination that I had never felt before. If Frank was planning to take us somewhere even more isolated, then my window for escape was closing rapidly. Whatever I was going to do, I had to do it soon. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to kill Frank Murdoch. The plan came to me with startling clarity as I lay in my bed that night, listening to Frank's drunken snores echoing through the thin walls. It wasn't a complicated plan. Complicated plans required resources and time that I didn't have. It was simple, direct, and designed around the one advantage I possessed: Frank's absolute certainty that I was too weak and too frightened to fight back. For 3 days, I watched Frank's routines with new eyes, not looking for opportunities to escape, but for opportunities to strike. I noted that he always kept a loaded pistol in the drawer of his bedside table, that he was at his most vulnerable during his post-dinner drinking sessions, and that Jack's bedroom was far enough from the living room that he might not hear what was happening until it was too late to interfere. On Thursday evening, October 15th, everything aligned perfectly. Frank had consumed more alcohol than usual during dinner, celebrating what he called the final arrangements for our move to the isolated property up north. Jack had retreated to his room immediately after eating, claiming he had a headache. I was alone in the kitchen, washing dishes and thinking about murder. At 9:30 p.m., Frank called me into the living room. He was sitting in his usual chair, the television flickering in the background, a glass of whiskey balanced on the arm of his chair. He looked relaxed and confident the way he always did when he was about to hurt me. "Come here, Evelyn," he said, patting his knee. "I want to talk to you about our move next week." I walked over to him slowly, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. But Frank was too drunk and too confident to notice anything unusual about my behavior. "You're going to like the new place," he continued, reaching out to grab my wrist and pull me closer. "No neighbors, no teachers, no one to interfere with our family business. Just you, me, and Jack learning to live the way nature intended." His grip on my wrist tightened, and I could see the familiar look of anticipation in his eyes that meant he was planning something particularly unpleasant for later that evening. "Of course, there will have to be some changes in the way we do things," he went on. "No more pretending for the benefit of outsiders. No more worrying about what people might think or say. Just honest family relationships the way they were meant to be." I nodded, as if I agreed with him, letting him pull me even closer. When I was within arm's reach of his chair, I made my move. The heavy glass ashtray from the coffee table was exactly where I had positioned it earlier that evening, close enough to grab in one quick motion. Frank never saw it coming. I brought it down on his head with every ounce of strength I possessed, putting all my fear and rage and desperation behind the blow. The sound it made, a wet, solid thunk, would stay with me for the rest of my life. Frank's eyes went wide with shock and confusion, then rolled back in his head as he slumped forward in his chair. Blood began flowing from a gash in his scalp, soaking into his shirt and dripping onto the carpet. For a moment, I thought I had killed him. He wasn't moving, wasn't breathing that I could see, and there was so much blood. But then he made a low groaning sound, and his eyelids fluttered, and I realized that he was still alive. That's when Jack appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of the impact. He took in the scene, Frank slumped and bleeding in his chair, me standing over him with the blood-stained ashtray still in my hands, and his face went white with shock. "Jesus Christ, Evelyn," he whispered. "What did you do?" "I hit him," I said, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. "I hit him with the ashtray." Jack took a step closer, staring at his father's unconscious form. "Is he dead?" "I don't think so, but he's hurt bad." We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, both of us staring at Frank and trying to process what had just happened. Then Frank made another groaning sound, and his head began to lift slightly, and I realized that he was going to wake up soon. When he did wake up, he would be furious. He would make both Jack and me pay for what I had done in ways that would make everything we had endured before seem like gentle correction. And then he would take us to his isolated property up north, where no one would ever find our bodies. "Chai," I said urgently, "we have to finish this. If he wakes up, he'll kill us both." Jack stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Evelyn, we can't murder him. We're not murderers." "He is," I said simply. "He's been murdering us a little bit at a time for months. This is just faster." Frank's head was rising more now, and I could see his eyes beginning to focus. In another minute or two, he would be fully conscious and extremely angry. "The gun," I said to Jack. "It's in his bedroom in the drawer next to his bed. Get it." Jack shook his head frantically. "No, Evelyn. No, I can't do that. There has to be another way." "There is no other way," I hissed, keeping my voice low so Frank wouldn't hear. "Look at him, Jack. Look at what he's made us into. Are you going to let him do this to other kids after we're dead?" That seemed to reach something inside Jack that my other arguments had not. He looked at Frank's bloody, semi-conscious form, then at me, then back at Frank again. "Other kids? You think we're the first? You think he invented all those techniques and equipment just for us?" I could see Jack beginning to understand. "How many others do you think there have been, Jack? How many others will there be after he gets rid of us?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, processing this idea. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward Frank's bedroom. He came back with the pistol, holding it like it might explode in his hands. Frank was starting to move more now, making sounds that suggested he would be fully awake very soon. "I can't," Jack whispered, offering me the gun. "I can't shoot him, Evelyn, but you can. You're stronger than I am." I took the pistol, surprised by how heavy it felt in my hands. I had never held a gun before, but Frank had talked about them often enough that I knew the basics of how they worked. Frank's eyes opened just as I was pointing the barrel at his chest. For a moment, he looked confused, like he couldn't quite understand what he was seeing. Then understanding dawned, and his face twisted with rage. "You little bitch," he snarled, trying to stand up from his chair. "You have no idea what you've just done to yourself." "Yes, I do," I said, and pulled the trigger. The sound was incredibly loud in the small living room, much louder than I had expected. Frank jerked backward in his chair, his eyes wide with shock, and something that might have been respect. There was a small hole in his shirt just above his heart, and blood was beginning to spread around it. He looked down at the wound, then up at me, then at Jack, who was standing frozen by the doorway. "Well," he said quietly, almost conversationally, "I guess I taught you something after all." Those were the last words Frank Murdoch ever spoke. He slumped forward in his chair, the life going out of his eyes, and finally, mercifully, he was dead. The silence that followed the gunshot seemed to stretch on forever. Jack and I stood there staring at Frank's lifeless body, neither of us quite able to believe that it was really over. After so many months of living in constant fear, the sudden absence of that fear felt almost surreal. "Is he really dead?" Jack whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow wake Frank up. I moved closer to the chair and checked for a pulse the way I had seen nurses do in movies. Frank's wrist was already growing cold, and there was no heartbeat that I could detect. "He's dead," I confirmed, and saying the words out loud made them feel real for the first time. Jack sank down onto the couch, his face pale and his hands shaking. "What do we do now? We can't just leave him here." That was a good question. I had planned the murder itself, but I hadn't thought much about what would happen afterward. We couldn't call the police despite everything Frank had done to us. They would see only 2 teenagers who had killed their guardian. We couldn't leave the body where it was and pretend nothing had happened. And we couldn't simply disappear because we would be the obvious suspects when Frank was eventually found. But as we sat there in the living room with Frank's corpse, I remembered something Mrs. Rodriguez had said about survival situations requiring creative thinking and the ability to turn disadvantages into advantages. Jack. I said slowly, an idea beginning to form. What if we don't try to hide what we did? What if we call the police ourselves and tell them exactly what happened? Jack looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Evelyn, we just committed murder. If we confess, they'll put us in prison for the rest of our lives. Not if we can prove that Frank was abusing us. Not if we can show that this was self-defense." I ran to my room and retrieved my journal from its hiding place behind the loose board. Frank had read from it the night he discovered it, but he hadn't taken it away or destroyed it. All my careful documentation of the abuse was still there, recorded in my own handwriting with dates and specific details that would be hard to dismiss. This is our evidence," I told Jack, holding up the notebook. "Everything he did to us, everything he made you do to me, it's all written down here. And there are other things too. The photographs he took, the equipment he bought, the threats he made. We can prove that he was a monster." Jack looked skeptical. "But will anyone believe us? We're just kids, and he's dead, so he can't defend himself. People might think we made it all up to justify what we did." It was a valid concern, but I had thought of that too. "The photographs, Jack. Frank kept all the photographs he took, and he was proud of his collection. They're still in his bedroom along with all the equipment. That's physical evidence that no one can dismiss or explain away." We spent the next hour gathering evidence before calling the police. In Frank's bedroom, we found not just the photographs he had taken of us, but hundreds of other images that made it clear we were not his first victims. There were pictures of children I didn't recognize, some who looked even younger than I had been when the abuse started. There were also letters and documents that suggested Frank had been involved in some kind of network of people who traded this type of material. The equipment was even more damning. Frank had invested thousands of dollars in professional photography gear, lighting systems, and what could only be described as torture devices. No one looking at that collection could believe it was the hobby of a normal, law-abiding adult. When we finally called 911, I told the dispatcher simply that there had been a shooting at our address and that we needed police and an ambulance. I didn't try to explain what had happened over the phone. That conversation needed to happen in person, with the evidence laid out where it could speak for itself. The police arrived within 10 minutes, followed by paramedics and what seemed like half the emergency services in the county. Jack and I sat on the front porch with our hands visible, waiting to be arrested, while uniformed officers secured the scene and detectives began documenting what they had found. Detective Sarah Morrison, no relation to Dr. Morrison, who had attended my mother, was the lead investigator assigned to the case. She was a woman in her 40s, with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested she had seen too much of humanity's dark side. She listened to our story without interruption, taking notes and asking occasional clarifying questions. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said when we had finished. "You're telling me that Frank Murdoch had been sexually abusing both of you for over a year, and that when he threatened to move you to an isolated location where the abuse could continue without interference, you decided to kill him in self-defense." "That's right," I said. "We knew that if we went to that property, we would never come back alive." Detective Morrison nodded thoughtfully. And you documented this abuse in a journal which Mr. Murdoch discovered but didn't destroy. He read parts of it to me, I explained. He said he was going to use it as evidence that I was lying about what happened or that I was somehow encouraging the abuse. I'll need to examine that journal along with all the other evidence you've described. If what you're telling me is true, this case will be classified as justifiable homicide rather than murder. The investigation took 3 weeks. During that time, Jack and I were placed in separate foster homes, while the police and social services tried to piece together the full scope of what Frank had been doing. The evidence was overwhelming, not just my journal and the photographs, but financial records showing Frank's involvement in the commercial exploitation of children, correspondence with other abusers, and physical evidence from the house that corroborated every detail of our story. The other children in Frank's photographs were identified, and several of them came forward to provide testimony about their own experiences with him. It became clear that Jack and I were not just victims, but survivors of a much larger criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. When Detective Morrison finally called us back to the police station, her first words were, "You're not going to be charged with any crime. The district attorney has ruled this a clear case of self-defense, and frankly, I'm amazed you survived as long as you did." The months following Frank's death were a blur of legal proceedings, therapy sessions, and the slow, difficult process of learning how to live without fear. Jack and I were both placed in specialized treatment programs designed for survivors of severe abuse, and gradually we began to heal from the trauma we had endured. Jack recovered more slowly than I did. The guilt and shame of what he had been forced to do to me weighed heavily on him, and it took years of therapy before he could forgive himself for his role in the abuse. But eventually, he found his way back to the person he had been before Frank destroyed his childhood. He went to college on a scholarship, became a social worker specializing in cases of child abuse, and dedicated his life to protecting other children from the kind of monster his father had been. I threw myself into my education with the same intensity I had once put into documenting the abuse. I graduated from high school at 16, earned my bachelor's degree at 19, and by 25, I had a master's degree in clinical psychology and was working with other survivors of trauma. My journal, which had started as a desperate attempt to document the truth of my situation, became the foundation for my doctoral dissertation on the psychology of survival in extreme circumstances. The house where Frank had held us prisoner was eventually torn down, and a small park was built on the site. Jack and I attended the dedication ceremony together, along with several of the other survivors who had been identified during the investigation. It was a day of closure and remembrance, a way of transforming a place of horror into something that could serve the community in a positive way. But the real surprise came 10 years after Frank's death, when I was cleaning out my mother's belongings in preparation for donating them to charity. I had kept everything exactly as she had left it, unable to face the task of sorting through her personal effects while I was still dealing with the aftermath of the abuse. Hidden in the bottom of her jewelry box, wrapped in tissue paper and tucked behind a false back that I had never noticed, I found a letter addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. The envelope was sealed and dated just 2 weeks before her death, during the time when she was already too sick to work, but still lucid enough to understand what was happening to her. The letter was brief but devastating. "My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found yourself in the situation I most feared. I know about Frank Murdoch's sweetheart. I know what kind of man he is and what he is capable of. I made a terrible mistake in trusting him, and I am so sorry that my error in judgment has put you in danger. Frank began showing interest in you months before I became sick. I caught him watching you when he thought no one was looking, and I heard him asking questions about your development and maturity that made my skin crawl. When I confronted him about it, he convinced me that I was being paranoid and overprotective. He was so charming, so persuasive, that I began to doubt my own instincts. But a mother's instincts are rarely wrong, and I know now that Frank has been planning this for months. He has been waiting for me to die so that he can have complete control over you. I am writing this letter because I may not live long enough to protect you myself, but I can at least warn you and give you the tools you need to protect yourself. Under the floorboard beneath my dresser, you will find a metal box containing evidence of Frank's criminal activities that I gathered during my last weeks. Photographs, documents, recordings, everything you would need to prove what kind of man he really is. I also left you $5,000 in cash, enough to disappear if you need to, and the contact information for a lawyer in Des Moines who specializes in helping children in dangerous situations. I am so sorry that I cannot be there to protect you myself, my brave girl. But I know you have the strength to survive whatever Frank has planned, and I know you will find a way to escape him. You are braver and stronger than you realize, and you have more allies than you know. All my love. Mama! I sat on the floor of my apartment, holding the letter and crying harder than I had cried since the night my mother died. All those months of feeling completely alone and abandoned, all that time spent believing that no one knew or cared what was happening to me, my mother had known. She had tried to protect me even from beyond the grave. I found the metal box exactly where her letter said it would be, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had been her bedroom. The evidence it contained would have been enough to put Frank in prison for the rest of his life if he had lived long enough to be arrested. More importantly, it would have spared Jack and me months of abuse if I had known where to look for it. But maybe that was the point. Maybe some battles can only be fought and won by the people who are living through them. Maybe my mother knew that I needed to find my own strength, my own way of surviving and overcoming the evil that Frank represented. The money from the box allowed me to establish a foundation dedicated to helping other survivors of childhood abuse. The evidence helped law enforcement identify and prosecute other members of Frank's network, leading to the rescue of dozens of children and the conviction of predators across 3 states. Today, 30 years after that terrible night when I killed Frank Murdoch in our living room, I can say with certainty that every moment of suffering was worth it if it led to saving even one other child from a similar fate. The girl who was once so frightened and powerless that she could barely speak above a whisper has become a woman who speaks truth to power, who fights for the innocent, and who never, ever gives up. Jack and I remain close friends, bonded by our shared experience in a way that few people can understand. He married a wonderful woman who knows our story and loves us both despite, or perhaps because of, the darkness we survived together. They have 2 children now, a boy and a girl, who will grow up knowing that they are safe and loved and protected. As for me, I never married or had children of my own. My calling has been to serve as mother and protector to the countless children who have crossed my path over the years, each one carrying their own story of survival and resilience. They have taught me that the human spirit is far stronger than those who would seek to break it realize, and that love, real, unconditional love, can overcome even the most terrible circumstances. The ceramic angel that once sat on our Christmas tree still sits on my desk. Her painted smile, a reminder of the mother who loved me enough to prepare me for a battle she couldn't fight herself. Sometimes, when I'm working late into the night on a particularly difficult case, I swear I can hear my mother's voice whispering the words that have guided me through every challenge I've faced. You are braver and stronger than you realize, and you have more allies than you know. She was right about the strength. She was right about the allies. And most importantly, she was right about my ability to transform the worst experience of my life into a force for good in the world. That transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy. But it was possible. And if it was possible for me, it's possible for anyone who finds themselves trapped in a situation that seems hopeless. That's the message I want to leave with you, whatever your own struggles might be. You are stronger than you know. You have more power than you realize. And you are never, ever truly alone.